Welcome back to A Good Run podcast with Daniel Feldman. I'm Asher Feldman, and this is episode 7, Re-elect John Lindsay for Mayor. On this episode, Dan sits down with Leah to discuss his early involvement in the re-election campaign for Mayor Lindsay in 1969. It's a little technical, it's a little in the weeds, so if you'd like to do a little bit of exterior research or add to any of your understanding of the episode itself, feel free to check out Dan's previous blog, Tales from the Sausage Factory, on WordPress, or read any of the many various articles around the web about that time period in New York City politics. As a reminder, we're available on Twitter to take your feedback, questions, concerns, really anything. We'd love to hear from you at A Good Run Podcast, on our blog, agoodrunpodcast.wordpress.com, or via email, agoodrunpodcast@gmail.com. So enjoy this episode with Dan and Leah, and we'll see you next time. Thanks so much for listening.
Feldman. My name is Leah Feldman, and we are recording this podcast from our home today in New York, as opposed to out on Long Island where we normally record from. So a little bit of a change of setting, but I think it's actually maybe appropriate because we are discussing the political campaign of Mayor John Lindsay and how you, Dan, were involved in his campaign and how he as an individual was sort of fascinating character because of he had a lot of really sort of almost contradictory characteristics. He was this very tall, good-looking man who, appeared to be very wealthy and from, a very wealthy background. And yet it really it didn't quite match with how his political campaigns sort of unfurled. So you spoke a bit in your last episode, or maybe one or two before, about how Lindsay entered into the public eye, and you discuss in this podcast about supporting someone who, despite his being maybe an unusual Republican, was a Republican candidate, and also referencing the fact that many people, progressive Democrats like yourself, weren't even willing to support Javits, who was a New Yorker and a Jew and, fairly liberal, but was a Republican. And, he was not allowed, but Lindsay was. How can you explain that?
Well, part of the problem was that Lindsay's opponent, actually his two opponents, were so right-wing. I mean, I can't think of a Democrat who was as right-wing as Mario Procaccino up to that point. There may have been some, but it's hard to conjure them up. I can't actually remember any. And John Markey, who later in my life I learned was a very impressive and honorable and intelligent person, nonetheless was a Republican conservative and was very conservative. So I think Lindsay got support from progressive Democrats partly because he was progressive himself, but also partly because of the nature of his opposition.
Well, I mean, can you tell us a bit more about his opposition? I mean, you mentioned in this particular post about how Procaccino was sort of portrayed to be, I think you mentioned, or you told me this as an aside, a Woody Allen comment about him appearing like the fathers of the girls he would take out sitting in, their wife beater tank tops, waiting for their daughters to come home. Right. I mean, he was not someone.
It's probably unfair to Procaccino, but that was his image, and it came out of the fact that probably the Ocean Hill-Brownsville conflict, which had during a couple of years earlier, during the Lindsay's first term. This is remember we're talking about Lindsay's re-election campaign. So during his first term, the community control of the schools, which was some might say a euphemism for getting rid of the power of the teachers union, was a giant conflict, and the teachers union was overwhelmingly Jewish and to some extent Italian, and the communities in question were black, and their complaint, which there was a lot of legitimacy to it, was that they had no control. Of course, at that time, power was highly centralized in the Board of Education, but the teachers union was a very powerful player, and the communities were a distant third at best, and not even that. And so Rhodey McCoy at the Ocean Hill-Brownsville district was, I guess, the first real leader of this movement, and Lindsay facilitated the community taking control of hiring in the district, and they fired a number of the Jewish teachers, replaced them with black teachers. Anyway, this fomented a tremendous conflict, as a result of which many Jewish and Italian voters who had been reasonably progressive at this point reacted very conservatively. On top of the fact that the snow removal in Queens hadn't been done quickly, and in fact had been done very slowly, and Lindsay's handling of the first transit strike wasn't ideal. Anyway, all this generated a conservative movement among Jewish and Italian voters, and in those days that was a very big percentage of the electorate in New York City, and so a rather right-wing candidate like Procaccino rode that wave, and won. I don't remember who his Democratic primary opponents were, but that part of the public was then willing to support a pretty right-wing Democrat, which was Mario Procaccino. And Markey, of course, was ideologically conservative. So that shaped the campaign.
I noticed a bit in my reading of this particular post, and even in your description of what brought people to a candidate like Procaccino, what could have pushed people away from Lindsay as a candidate, it seems to me that people, their reaction, at least the voters, their reaction to the wrongs of an individual is not necessarily to move away from the individual, but to move away from the party. I don't know if I see that as necessarily effective. I mean, if you could characterize what you think, watching a candidate, possibly commit faults in his election, like his Lindsay's inadequate treatment of the snow in Queens, or the inadequate response to the transit strike. I mean, I can understand moving away from Lindsay as a candidate or as an individual, but I don't know if I would necessarily assume that the best move is to move towards a more conservative mindset in general, as opposed to just moving away from a candidate.
Well, two things. First, the school strike, and let me go beyond that. Lindsay, in '68, after the assassination of Martin Luther King, there were racial riots around the country, not in New York. Because Lindsay, with his staff, assiduously courted and went out to places in Harlem and in black areas of Brooklyn, and funded community programs and things like that. And so between that and the school strike, the electorate their perception was, oh, he's for the blacks and not for us. Yeah. And I should have mentioned, Lindsay lost the Republican primary to John Markey. Now, this is an incumbent mayor, an office holder losing the primary in his own party to a state legislator. Yeah.
How do you explain that?
Well, the same thing. The Republicans in New York, which to this day are more progressive than the national Republicans.
Yes, of course.
But in those days were way more progressive. You mentioned Jacob Javits, Nelson Rockefeller. Yeah. These were liberal Republicans.
Very,
and Lindsay was in that mold. Yeah. But just as these events in the first Lindsay administration pushed Democrats to the right, they pushed Republicans to the right too. So he was running as an independent, and again as the candidate of the Liberal Party, which wasn't so liberal, but that's another story. But in any case, there weren't that many Republicans. I don't know if Republicans turned away from their party. Liberal Democrats turned away from the candidate of their party, Mario Procaccino. They most of them stayed Democrat.
Yeah. How interesting. I wonder, I guess this is a bit off of our topic, but something I'm sure you're aware of anyway. Would you characterize the party politics now as being drawn with thicker lines than they were then?
I'm not sure I understand the question.
Do you think that there is more of a loyalty to one's party beyond candidates as individuals now than there was then?
No, less.
Less,
yeah. I mean, there was a big shift in party affiliation in the New Deal when many people who had been sort of on the progressive side had been Republican, starting from the Theodore Roosevelt era, and Franklin Roosevelt moved them to the Democratic column. Then there was another huge shift after the Civil Rights Act in '64, when the Democrats lost the South, essentially, which had been solidly Democratic, and moved away from the Democrats bit by bit after the '64 Civil Rights Act. And in addition, the what they call the Reagan Democrats, who even in the North, some working people, unions had, and still are, their leadership is still overwhelmingly Democratic, but a great many members, to some extent, on social issues and now more on economic issues again, are rejecting the globalism and things like that seem more associated. Well, actually, it's bad to say seem more associated with the Democratic Party. In fact, globalization has been associated with the Democratic and Republican Party. And today, this year's election is completely bizarre. So, that throws everything into confusion. So maybe I should stay away from that.
Yeah.
But still, I do think party affiliation is weaker now than it was then.
Okay, so you think that now people are more willing to see candidates for who they are as individuals and their platforms as opposed to.
Yes.
Interesting. Okay, well, anyway, that's good to know. Going back to the topic of the hour, John Lindsay.
Right.
I unfortunately was not alive during John Lindsay's administration.
Well, that's not unfortunate. It means he's nice and young. So.
It's true, but it maybe offers me less credibility on who he was as a candidate and as a person. What I was able to see were pictures of John Lindsay, and the man is strikingly handsome. I mean, movie star handsome is a way to put it, I would say. And, it wasn't just his good looks. He's also, he sort of from this, as you described, waspy background. He came from a father who's a stockbroker. He is what some people might characterize as a limousine liberal, someone who never really got their feet dirty and, maintained clean fingernails.
Well, to the extent that you can, if you're an elected official, if you run for office or run for Congress, as he did, you've mixed with the people at least a little bit.
Sure, but there is one.
Of course, his district was the Silk Stocking District,
right?
The Upper East Side,
of course.
So,
there is one sort of anecdote you mentioned about someone in his campaign party being unable to locate Queens on a map.
Right. Now, whether this story is 100% true is unclear. Jimmy Breslin is. I love Jimmy Breslin. He's a wonderful writer, but it's not crystal clear that he always stuck precisely to the facts. Nonetheless, he wrote this column in New York Magazine during the campaign, at a point in the campaign when it looked like Lindsay could very easily lose. And the thrust of the article was essentially what's wrong with the Lindsay campaign. And Breslin's bottom line was that what's wrong with the campaign was that they were only attracting, Manhattan liberal types and did not have any sense of the real working people in the outer boroughs. And to illustrate this point, he said that this woman Democratic district leader from the Upper West Side of Manhattan, i.e. ultra liberal, et cetera, is supporting Lindsay, and she's and presumably advising the campaign, and she's standing in front of a map of the 5 boroughs at the Lindsay campaign headquarters, which is in the old DePinna building, and 52nd and I remember. I spent so much time there. I think it was Park or Madison. But anyway, standing in front of the map and looks at the map and says, "Now let me see which one is Queens." And there was an interesting coda to that story, which is that some years, maybe 10, 15 years thereafter, Breslin's wife passed away, who he was very devoted to, by all accounts, a very fine woman. But anyway, and some years after that, he remarried. And about 10 years after that, I ran into him at some political event. I no longer remember what it was. And I said, "Mr. Breslin, 35 years ago, you wrote this column talking about this female district leader standing from the map saying, now let me see which one is Queens. Is it not true that you have subsequently married that woman?" And he gave me a big smile, said, "Fuck you," and walked away.
I would imagine he would not have expected someone to remember or have read into those details.
Right.
But for all of the points that those stories and stories like that illustrate, one would think that someone who is a very progressive Democrat, someone who is someone who's instigating, reform liberal, Did you ever have any issue with this sort of, clean cuticled man that, it seemed as if maybe it wasn't, as you mentioned, John Breslin Jimmy Breslin might not be, a purveyor of the facts and facts only. But I mean, would that have affected you at that time?
Well, first of all, I was an outer borough guy myself. I was born in the Bronx, grew up in Queens, but the reactionary attitude of Procaccino and the people by and large, the people supporting Lindsay was very far from my point of view. I mean, while I am proudly Jewish, I certainly had some. Sympathy is the wrong word, but I understood the legitimate aspect of the black community and wanting some control over the schools. And while I might not have agreed with them 100%, I certainly knew, not only thought, but I think I can say I knew that Lindsay's instincts in this matter were not entirely wrong. In fact, were, at least to a great extent, correct. Yes, he's messed up to some extent with the snow removal and the transit strike, but he did keep our city free of race riots. And look, I was well aware that he'd made many mistakes, but I was also well aware that the ethos that drove his administration was admirable, and mean-spiritedness, which certainly characterized the Procaccino campaign, and maybe some of the people who supported Markey, although, again, I learned later that John Markey was a very admirable guy personally. But that kind of mean-spiritedness was something I thought had to be rejected. And I felt that way very strongly. So I wasn't conflicted about it.
I can understand that. I mean, I think in whatever form it comes in, someone with goals and concepts and ethos that you find lie well with you. It doesn't matter what they look like or where they're from.
And frankly, I had met John Lindsay as a New York City urban fellow, and I really liked him.
He seems like he would be a very likable character.
Very likable guy.
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah. I mean, as the story I think you mentioned in the last podcast about the strike going on outside of the developmentally disabled Center for Children in Manhattan Beach, the women slowly putting their picketing signs down.
Well, I mean, my sexual proclivities didn't go in that direction. But, but in addition to being incredibly good looking, he was also a really nice guy.
Right, of course, yeah. I think that matters. I think, it's something that I have thought recently in the lieu of, as it doesn't count for any of our discussions here since it's such an odd election now, but, it's as important as policy and platform is, nice also matters.
Right. Yeah.
I really do think it does. Yeah. So.
Well, I mean, I could make a political science argument that it's useful not to be so nice, but nonetheless, my personal instincts go with the nice. I can
understand. So, yeah, absolutely. So. All right. Well, I don't know if where are we at with time?
We have about 12 minutes to go.
Oh, 12 minutes to go. Oh, okay. Very great. I might poke into your next podcast a bit, if that's okay.
Yeah, fine.
All right. So, again, in lieu of the times that we're in now, your next podcast talks a bit about the kind of dirty underbelly of voting booths and how election day can occasionally be a playground for some less than admirable behavior on campaign trails.
Well, I think if we're going to go into it, we're going to really go into that, because this will be the heart of the next, what would otherwise have been the next podcast, but we could do it now. I don't see any alternative if that's where we're going.
Okay.
All right. So what happened is that I mentioned in the last podcast, I had been, as an urban fellow, I was assigned to Lance Liebman, who was the mayor's assistant for transportation and chair of the Urban Action Task Force. And I had done a major project for Lance, which I talked about in the last podcast, and then he asked if I was interested in politics. I said, extremely. Yes. And so he suggested that I take a 1 month leave of absence from the program and work in the Lindsay reelection campaign. And that's where I met Liz Holtzman. Liz and a fellow named Win Kramarski, who was a very interesting fellow, also another assistant, had themselves taken leave from their jobs to work in the campaign. And they were running what we will call defensive operations. And mission of defensive operations was to protect our strong areas, that is, areas where Lindsay was expected to do well, against dirty tricks by the opposition. Mm-hmm. What were some of those dirty tricks? Well, the electricians union somehow had control of the voting machines. They were electronic. They had some electronic aspects, and had to be plugged in. And if the plug came out, no one was allowed to put it back in except an electrician. This would naturally slow things down. If it was an area where we expected a lot of votes for Lindsay, presumably there'd be a long line of voters. If they're delayed for a very long period of time, a bunch of them are going to leave and they won't vote, and you will lose those votes. Similarly, if somebody loses a contact lens in the area, and is searching for it, there are a variety of these tricks. In any case, in those days, we had something called deputies attorney general, special deputies attorney general, who were appointed by this New York State attorney general to oversee election districts. You'd send one to each, or as many as you could. If you could cover the election districts, you'd send one to each. Not to each election district. I'm sorry, to each polling place. And these were authorized for the day to have powers of the AG, and for this purpose, so that the police officer at the site would follow their orders and so forth. They were the law experts, and they presumably would work to make sure that there were no illegalities involved. And so my first job was to recruit these people. Now, Louis Lefkowitz was the Attorney General. He was Republican, but also a very liberal Republican. And I don't know how acknowledged this was, but all these DAGs are supposed to be neutral. But I was calling law firms and calling from the Lindsay campaign to ask them to go up to the AG's office and get deputized for the day. And so I was calling basically every major and quite a few not so major law firms in the city, recruiting volunteers for the Lindsay campaign under the direction of Liz Holtzman and Lynn Komarski. And that's what we were doing. Now, whether we had any supporters who were going into the strong pro-Cucino areas and accidentally knocking plugs out of election machines or losing contact lenses, I have no direct evidence on this, which I truly don't. But I have my suspicions.
Okay. But presumably they had people there to protect the integrity of their polling booths as well.
Yes. I remember there was a commissioner, Steve, I don't remember his last name. Anyway, who had also taken a leave from the campaign. And I was there when he was briefing a couple of hundred of these deputies attorney general, special deputies attorney general. And he said, I don't know if I can, he had a bit of a New York accent too, which I may mimic to some extent. He said, you guys are going to be out there to, inform people of the law, this election law, and make sure nothing untoward happens. He says, but look around. He says, most of you guys are wearing ties. Most of you guys are wearing suits. He says, but I'm going to have a meeting after this one with some other guys, and they're going to be helping you. They're going to be accompanying you. And most of these guys aren't going to be wearing ties. They aren't going to be wearing suits. They're sanitation police. So if you run into any trouble, I wouldn't worry about it.
I was not expecting that these people you called up from prestigious law firms in New York City were going to be applying any brute force to anyone who might have been kicking plugs out of outlets.
These were not only sanitation police, they were provisional sanitation police, which meant they didn't have tenure and they could be, their jobs weren't secure yet.
Right. And this maybe would help secure them. Yeah.
So this was not, what can I say? It wasn't our finest hour. However, I'm not someone who says the end justifies the means, but we did know that we were working in or at least we felt we were working in a noble cause, and I think I am confident that most of what we did truly was defensive. Mm-hmm. However,
are you aware of anything that was anything but defensive?
I have no direct evidence.
Okay. I
still have some suspicion.
Well, I mean, we're aware of the human condition and how people, if in the pursuit of power have done things that they're maybe not so proud of.
Right.
And if you have to take steps to prevent that from interfering with what should be right and just, then so be it. I understand. But I mean, it wouldn't be the first or the last time that something of this nature would have occurred. People are, as I mentioned, sort of blinded by the pursuit of power, and those that support them can be blinded by their pursuit of power.
Anyway, I felt uneasy enough about this so that when we did win an election night, if I was at the victory party, I didn't stay long. I still was,
the night of.
Yeah.
Okay.
I just didn't feel good about the role we had played. But
because of this?
Yeah.
Really?
And then a few days later, I went out with a couple of friends who had been in the campaign with me, a guy and 2 women, and we did a great deal of drinking. And I suffered, I would say, the worst hangover of my entire life. Subsequently. And I think maybe part of that drinking was in response to my mixed feelings about the role I played in the election.
I can understand that. Well, I mean, if there was any injustice that you had committed, it seems that you have given back what it is that you took in. All of the poison was expelled from you maybe the next day.
By the way, I have to say, I certainly, there were aspects of that Lindsay campaign that I enjoyed enormously. Remember, the Jewish vote was very significant, and it was very important for Lindsay to get that vote. Lindsay's campaign, Lindsay had, it was John Lindsay for mayor, Sanford Garelick for city council president, and Fioravante Parada for controller. Procaccino's slate was Procaccino for mayor, Abe Beam for controller, and was it Frank Smith? I don't remember who was city council. I should, but I don't remember who city council president candidate was. But in any case, an assembly member from the Bronx named Cy Posner, I think you pronounced it. It was spelled like Posner, but he pronounced it Posner. It was a short, colorful character, but he was a long-time assemblyman from the Bronx. And I remember I was there at the campaign headquarters when he did a press conference with Lindsay, announcing his endorsement of Lindsay, which was very important because to have any Jewish politician supporting him was in that, especially from the outer boroughs. I mean, Manhattan didn't count, but from the outer boroughs it was important. So Posner says, "I'm endorsing John Lindsay, Abe Beam, who was from the other slate, Democratic slate, and Sandy Garelick." He said, "An all-Jewish slate." I never saw Lindsay laugh so hard. He was ecstatic with that endorsement. So,
I'm sure. Honorary member of the community.
Right. Exactly.
Well, I would have been pretty pleased myself. That sounds quite nice, actually.
And of course, and again, this is where I met Liz Holtzman.
Integral member of your...
who has been, was early on an employer of mine, and to this day is a good friend.
Right.
And a person who was, again, with maybe the possible exception of that campaign effort, probably the most ethical person I've ever encountered in public life. Incredibly ethical, often to her own disadvantage. A person I admire enormously and like very, very much. I certainly don't want to leave the impression that it was not a good experience.
Yeah.
It was a great experience. And Win Kramarski was a bit of a character too. I remember in the second Lindsay administration, I will say there were some people that were drawn to the Lindsay route who I did not, it was something called the Unger organization.
Unger?
Yeah, it was a fellow named Unger who ran it. And these people and some others who came in the second administration were not of the same quality as the people in the first administration. And Kramarski had some very colorful language to describe these people. One in particular who he referred to as, the phrase was so colorful it still sticks in my mind, an ass-faced pig fucker.
Wow, colorful is a good word for that, yeah.
Wynn was quite a character. He was a very intelligent man and a very successful man, but colorful and fun to work with, as you can imagine.
Sure.
Wynn and Liz were like completely opposite.
Right,
but,
yeah.
Liz is extremely straight-laced.
Yeah.
But they made a good team, and anyway, it was a interesting. It was the first political campaign that I worked in at a kind of professional level, and it also enabled me to learn all the names of the major New York law firms before I even went to law school. Kind of unusual. I don't know. It was a little help to me.
Was it? Good.
Well, when I was applying to law firms, I
sure, you had a running list.
And I knew something about each firm.
Right,
so,
right. There you go. Great. Cool.
All right. So I think we've
I think we've
our mark.
Absolutely, and we think we've spanned some really interesting and diverse topics during our chat today. But I think there's still a bit more on the Lindsay campaign we're going to chat about in upcoming blog posts. So thank you so much for joining us. Thanks, Dan, for helping us out. And we hope you join us next time for our next episode of A Good Run.
Great.
Thank you so much.
Thanks.